How do I center clay?
So centering clay is one of the most difficult things when it comes to working on the wheel. So I often talk about making your clay into a nice round ball so that you're setting yourself up for success. I place that ball in the middle of the wheel and I apply downward pressure. I like to use the analogy of a suction cup. I want to force any air or water out from underneath of the clay and get it firmly affixed to the bat or the wheel head before I apply inward pressure. After I get it affixed to the wheel head, I start out by applying inward pressure and driving my clay upward, followed by applying downward pressure to drive my clay back down. And it's the equilibrium between both pushing down and pushing in that will eventually get your clay on center.
What's the difference between stoneware, earthenware, and porcelain?
All right, when I'm describing clay, I often like to use a metaphorical mountain. And so that mountain, if we thought about the peak of that mountain being porcelain, we think about how the earth erodes and that material travels down this mountain. And along the way, it's picking up contaminants. And we often think of sort of like contaminants as like a negative connotation, but in this case, it could be really positive. So at the base of the mountain, we might have a stoneware clay. So that porcelain has traveled down the mountain, it's picked up a little bit of iron, it's picked up some other, contaminants and has effectively reduced the firing temperature. It's not always, there's always an exception to the rule. But then as that stoneware continues to erode down into the valley, it picks up even more, and that becomes earthenware. And that earthenware has more contaminants in it, which generally lower the melting point, and so it is reducing its firing temperature ultimately.
How do I know if my clay is too dry or too wet?
I think that the easiest definition for that is when your clay is too wet, if you can't roll it into a coil without more clay ending up on your hands than in the coil, it's a good indicator that it might be a little too wet. If your clay is too dry, oftentimes when you wedge it or you manipulate it, it cracks or doesn't respond to your touch.
What is wedging and why is it so important?
Wedging is the act, it's very similar to kneading dough, except for sometimes when you're kneading dough, you're incorporating air into the kneading process. But when you're wedging, you're actually working to make your material homogeneous, which means it's dense, the same density all the way through. In addition to that, you're also moving the core material from the clay from the inside to the outside and hopefully removing air in the process. While trapped air doesn't always equal an explosion, if water expands into an air pocket, it can blow out in your clay. So typically we are wedging to remove those air pockets and to make even density all the way through.
Why does my clay crack when I try to shape it?
Oh, clay cracks. So a lot of times your clay cracks because it's not plastic. And it can, we can do some things to make clay more plastic. So one of those things that we talked about earlier was wedging. When you wedge the clay, you're aligning the particles. Clay particle looks like a little dinner plate or like a little platelet. And when those platelets are stacked on top of each other and they slide, it doesn't crack. But when those particles are in random orientation and we apply pressure to our clay, it can sometimes open up like a crack.
How do I avoid air bubbles in my clay?
One is by starting out with a material that's homogeneous. So that can either be through purchasing clay from a manufacturer that uses a large-scale pug mill or a large-scale mixing machine, or more likely than not, you're going to be wedging that material. And when you wedge that material appropriately, you're going to be removing all of the air and creating a homogeneous mass of clay so it would have equal density throughout.
What's the best way to add handles to my pottery?
Adding handles to your pottery is subjective, or the best way to add handles to your pottery is a subjective question. My favorite way to add a handle to your pot is by either hand building that handle or slab building that handle.
How do I attach a handle to my pot?
All right, so attachments are one of my favorite parts of clay. If my hand is the part of the pot that I want to attach to, and my other hand is the attachment. I'm going to use either a serrated rib, a paper clip, anything that kind of has a point to it, and I'm going to score that clay. I'm going to score both the part of the pot that I want to attach, and I'm going to score the attachment. I'm then going to impart a small amount of water into one of those two sides, and I'm going to rescore and put them together. The idea is that when we attach them, those score marks intersect with each other. As clay dries, it shrinks. So our goal is that that attachment is good enough that as that material shrinks, it doesn't pop off.
How do I prevent my pottery from warping during drying?
To keep a piece of pottery from warping, we want to avoid bending or distorting it through the creation process. And we want to try to keep our movements as intentional as possible. I had a mentor who basically said, we want to make this while touching it as little as humanly possible. It doesn't mean we're not touching it a lot. It just means that we're touching it only enough. If you have any questions, comment below. I'll be happy to help.